Winnipeg has a whole shopping list of needs, whether it's down the middle or on the back end. Will the Jets get their help this offseason? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode wanted to spend some time talking about some roster needs for the Jets, right? Winnipeg obviously is still kind of in a bit of a transition state. I think the Jets are probably trying to take stock of what they have, what they're missing, and figure out what the best path forward is, especially with Scott Arniel wanting to take this team in a bit of a different direction, which, always we appreciate, some fresh perspective, a new approach, and something that you might hail as novel, which for the Jets, I think would really be a refreshing thing. If Winnipeg is really serious about improving and kind of moving forward, the thing with the Jets is that they're going to have a very active offseason. This is not a team that's going to be able to sort of rest on its laurels, and I think we know that, the roster, it's not nearly as close as we'd like to being a top-end contender, but maybe it's not like crazy far off either. There's stuff to work with, and it's really crucial that the Jets make the right decisions in a couple of key categories and positions. We'll talk about which ones I'd like the Jets to focus on in just a moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets have a couple of crucial needs, and one of the biggest ones that Winnipeg is going to have to figure out, and that probably is going to be one of the hardest things to fix. Unfortunately, none of the Jets' absences are particularly easy to deal with, but Winnipeg is going to have to find a center, and that is really difficult. Now, I know that there's a lot of thought about moving with Sean Monahan in mind. I think a lot of people like Sean. I actually do enjoy him. I think he's a great player. I think the problem with Monahan and re-signing him is that he just doesn't really fit the direction the Jets are moving, especially if Arniel is to kind of be believed. This team had a really tough loss to the Avs, in which the lack of foot speed and the general approach that the Jets built was basically shown to really not be good enough. That's a tough lesson, a very painful one, and I think if you're Winnipeg, you would really show that you haven't learned enough if you went back to the same well that you kind of built last season, which, no offense to the Jets players that Winnipeg brought in, but I think we kind of saw that, unfortunately, Monahan and Toffoli were kind of shown to not really be the sort of style and the right fit for what Winnipeg needs to really be a top-end playoff contender. Because let's be real, the Jets are in the Central Division. They're going to be seeing a lot of opponents like Colorado and Dallas again and again over the next few years, which, that kind of means the Jets are going to have to be faster and younger and more skilled. You don't really have a lot of margin for error, and I think that's especially true when you're trying to find a second-line center. Now, the problem for Winnipeg is that, as much as we do love Scheifele and everything, he's not like a McKinnon or something. He's always been a really good first-line center, but not as elite as a lot of top-line centers around the league. And that's kind of where the Jets have to make up for that a bit by having a really good 1-2 punch, right? A drop-off that's a little bit less noticeable. And one player that I think has stood out to people is Martin Necas, because he is a center, and he's had a pretty good run with the Canes, My caution there is that I think in a lot of ways Nietzsche is a sort of incomplete product. And I think despite having some good looking counting stats and stuff, the way that he creates offense doesn't really stand out as being the sort of thing that the Jets are going to get a lot of value out of. I kind of look at it in the same vein that I look at Monahan, which is as a complementary player, they're nice. They have some good finishing ability. There's some skilled playmaking. But the biggest problem is that the Jets really need somebody who can drive their own bus. And I don't think Nietzsche really does that. Monahan definitely doesn't do it as much. Nietzsche is probably in a very similar category. Even on a team that has as much skill and depth as the Canes do, Nietzsche was perhaps a little bit of a step behind some of his peers. That's not to say that he's a bad player. That's not the case at all. He's pretty good, but he's not really what the Jets need. And if they were to swap Ehlers for him, I don't really think that they're getting the sort of improvement that they would really like. And I'm going to be honest. I don't think that a lot of the center options out there in the free agency market are really going to move the needle either. If you're looking at Teuvo Teravainen or Adam Henrique or even Steven Stamkos, Stamkos is obviously really good, but he's not leaving Tampa Bay. So looking down the list, in terms of free agents, there's just not that many names that really stand out, which is why Winnipeg is probably going to have to look more at the trade market, which, that's not the most exciting prospect, I know. But I think if you're thinking about teams that are going to have some availabilities, Anthony Cirelli has been a name that a lot of Jets fans recently have started to talk about. Cirelli is a really big piece and would require some real thought from the Jets about what they'd be willing to part with, right? It would take probably a bigger prospect, Ehlers, some sort of a package, and that kind of trade. It's a bit of a commitment because like Cirelli's not super young. He's also not old either. You're not really talking about a guy who's, completely out of his prime. But again, it's going to be a little pricey. I think that there's a likelihood that a big player that the Jets really enjoy gets moved as part of it because Cirelli would be, honestly, maybe Winnipeg's best overall center. He is a really big piece. He'd be a huge upgrade for the Jets. And, while he would be worth whatever you're giving up, I think the Jets also have to be realistic about what they can afford to give away, right? If Perfetti starts getting into the conversation and stuff, I don't know. Having a younger, cost-controlled asset who you plan to make a bigger part of your offense going forward, do you feel like you can lose that youth and some of the advantage of having him on a cheaper contract right now for a player who will help in the near term, but you'd really have to believe that the rest of the team is going to come along with him and that you can make them, like this team reach a higher competitive state. And I just don't know if I like that gamble at present versus kind of taking a slower, more measured approach. Dylan Strome also kind of fits in this category of being a guy who I think would definitely be a huge improvement in the short term. But A, I don't really think the Caps have a particular appetite to move him. And B, even if they did, he's just signed like a 5x5 deal and really just started that extension. I can't imagine that the price for acquiring him is going to be particularly palatable if you're the Jets. And so for Winnipeg, I don't know. This is a tough one. This might be an offseason where you don't really solve this particular need, but you start to figure out if, longer term, is Brad Lambert going to be your 2C? Will Adam Lowry take some of those duties? Nemeshnikov showed that he could do it, in spurts. I mean, he was a second line center earlier this past season, and it went well enough. But, do you want to like really start to make that a routine thing, or are you looking for like a higher end offensive attacker? And I think that's where the Jets would obviously like to make an upgrade, but it's just not so easy to get that done. So a lot to consider for the Jets up front, but I guess the biggest thing that Winnipeg might be thinking about is, in the grand scheme of things, right? Can you make a play on defense first? Because the amount of centers that are going to be available, probably not fantastic. But if the Jets make a big splash on the backside with an Ehlers trade or something, maybe they can start the process there. we'll talk about a couple of names that I've seen bandied about on Twitter and whether I think any of these guys would really be available and within Winnipeg's price range in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, like I mentioned earlier, tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of their great offers. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big victory of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. For those of you following the conference finals, obviously this has been a big deal if you're an NHL fan. A lot of these series have been tied. It's felt like honestly, a pretty darn good playoffs for the NHL. Traditionally, we see some less exciting matchups and stuff, but I'd be honest, I don't really know if anyone has a clear idea of who's actually going to emerge out of this playoffs. But if you think you do, this might be a really good time for you to get in on a great betting offer with FanDuel. Their platform is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And best of all, if you nail your pick with a $5 bet, you get $150 to try again and have even more fun. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com and get started today. Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us as we're just talking about some big roster gaps for the Jets and some stuff that they have to think about longer term with how to get this team back into a more competitive state quickly. Not that the Jets are really out of it per se, but I think compared to teams like Colorado, Dallas, at times even Vegas in some of their better years, the Jets are just a step behind in a couple of key categories. And it's not that they have to figure out every single piece of this offseason. I allude, to our third segment talking more about the timeline. And let's be real. One little spoiler that I can give you right now is that it's very unlikely that the Jets fix everything this offseason, which is fine. I think if you try to force everything to happen this offseason, you're going to end up in a really bad spot. And I don't think the Jets want to deal away from a position of strength and put themselves in a tougher spot than they need to, right? Part of this upcoming year, in my mind, should be a year focused on growth and evaluating what you have for the future. There's going to be some growing pains. I think there's going to be some tough challenges, and we'll talk about how the Jets might have to handle their back end, which I know is one of the most complicated pieces in just a moment. But for those of you who are Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, just wanted to catch you for a quick second. Some of you might have to turn it down because you find both of those channels have a lot of shouting. And if you're tired of that, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, the Jets, obviously, aside from having a big need at center, their second biggest need, and perhaps even the bigger need if you think about what Colorado took advantage of in this most recent playoff run, is a defense that's very slow and doesn't really have a lot of high-end puck-moving ability. That's been a problem for years now. It's not a secret, and I think the Jets have gotten away with it a lot longer than I kind of thought they would. This back end, I've kind of waffled back and forth on how much they can sort of get away with having their current core. But I think when you have guys like pierre-luc, and to a lesser extent Schmidt, eating up a fair few minutes while also eating up a fair bit of cap space, you find yourself in a really tough spot because as much as you really appreciate their efforts, you know that you're just not quite getting the return on the cap space and performance that you really need. And I think the Jets are in a tough spot because, they don't have a lot of options coming up in the prospect ranks to fill some of these gaps. And if you're Winnipeg and you're thinking, all these teams out there are drafting top-end defenders, we've picked up a couple ourselves, but we've also sort of had to be realistic about where we're drafting and who we're able to get at like picks 20, 30, or later, you realize that the top end blue liners that you have to get at the very front of the draft, they're just not within reach. And so the Jets have kind of done things more by a committee approach, which, like I said, I think for how they've done it, it's actually worked a lot better than you might expect. But in key moments in the playoffs, you saw guys like Pionk that the Jets really leaned on, really struggling to keep up. I think none are more obvious than some of the later games against the Avs, where the Jets defense just kind of got piecemealed. But like I said, I think with some teams making some moves out there and looking to change up their roster construction, have a big room shakeup, there's opportunities for the Jets to bring in somebody legitimately decent. And one guy that I've talked about in the past is Jakob Chychrun. Chychrun obviously isn't quite like the number one D that I think a lot of people thought he was going to be. The past few years have kind of been up and down. He's had some serious injuries. He's bounced around between, Arizona and Ottawa, and it's not really been smooth sailing. Recently, it sounds like he's not super committed to the Sens, and it makes sense. He's not really got much time with them left, and if you're looking at what the Sens have accomplished, I think there's been frustration with how the team has gone. Not dissimilar from what you've seen to the Jets over the past couple of years and some of our veteran players who have kind of expressed that they're pissed off. And so there's a sort of a natural alignment there where, you've got Ehlers, who at this point probably wants a change of scenery, a Sens team that might be looking to make a bold splash, and maybe they swap, Chychrun for Ehlers. It's not like a one-to-one situation. I don't know if anyone would really have to add here. Maybe the Jets do a little bit in the sense that they kick in like some peripherals that are not really high end, but because top four right D are always really prized and valued in this league. Maybe that's sort of where the value changes a little bit. But overall, right, I mean, if you made that swap, not necessarily one for one, but something close to it, you have an interesting change for both teams. I don't know if I really love it for the Sens. I think for the Jets, it would definitely incur and fix a big hole on the right side. But whether or not that's enough to sort of move Pionk and get this team to a more mobile back end with a more potent blue line, I'd say yes. I don't know if it moves the needle like loads, but if you're trying to find a top four right D who could potentially fix the Jets temporarily, Chychrun's an interesting bet. The other guy that's kind of come up recently is Ryan Pulock, and Pulock could be on the move out of the Isles. New York is definitely looking for some more offensive punch. For me, Pulock is a fun player. I think there's obviously more that would be involved in that trade if you're the Jets. Pulock, though, I mean, he's really good. I think he's like a really quality second pairing guy. I think the reality is the Jets are probably not getting a top pairing blue liner unless they went really crazy and made a huge splash, bigger than what we've ever seen them do. Probably a trade that's not that far off from like how earth-shattering the whole Dubois thing was. Something pretty crazy like that would probably take if you're trying to get an elite number 1D. And that's not really what Winnipeg is probably shooting for here. They're probably looking for a guy to, at some point, replace Pionk. I think Pionk hasn't really lived up as much to the contracts as you were hoping for. I think it's been a really rough go. And, the mental side of things, I think the decision-making hasn't quite been there. The speed of play has, occasionally put Pionk in a really tough spot. And so for the Jets, it's really time to start evaluating what his role with the team is. And if Winnipeg brings in a Chychrun or a Pulock or somebody of that ilk, you do put yourself in a better position to run, a pretty good first two pairings. And then you can kind of fill out the third pairing with guys like Heinola, maybe Colin Miller if you brought him back on a cheap deal, stuff like that, right? Miller might be a little bit more partial to Arneal's way of playing and what Scott's kind of preaching. I think with Bonus, he kind of had a pretty clear role on the bench. With Arneal, Arneal might be more willing to make use of his skill sets, which I mean, like Miller, for me, I don't think he's like a top end defender on like a high end competitor, but on a team like the Jets that quite frankly doesn't have a lot of great right handed depth, I don't mind him sliding on the third pairing and kind of taking that like Schmidt role of being a guy who kind of cycles in and out of the lineup to give you a different look and stuff. So, in terms of like big trade acquisitions, I mean, unless the Jets really swing for the fences somewhere, I think you're most likely looking at like a second pairing guy, and the Jets would likely have to add in most of the deals that they're trying to pull off here. Seattle, I guess, has the potential to be part of this conversation. Although I feel like in terms of blue liners, there's not really anyone that's going to catch Winnipeg's eye other than like a Vince Dunn or something. Which, if they go for a trade like that, it's going to take more. So I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I think it's definitely a thing that the Jets need to focus on. On the other, I just until some of the cap space clears for Winnipeg, and unless they can find some takers for Schmidt and Pionk's contracts, I just don't know how much flexibility the Jets are going to have here. And if Ehlers does kind of get a starring role with Arniel, I sort of wonder if that changes their perception on what they do with a contract extension after Ehlers' deal is up, or if it's even worth pursuing that. It's a very big iffy situation. The thing with Perfetti is like he didn't get along with bonuses much, but he also has rights control that sits with the Jets. Ehlers is a UFA, and so that status change definitely puts things a lot more up in the air for how Winnipeg's going to play it. I mean, they are trying to shop him apparently. That's a tough one to hear, but unless like a really quality top four defender emerges, I just don't know what the best route here is. And I think that this is one of those questions that probably doesn't get solved until you have a better sense of what Salomonsson is. He's kind of like Winnipeg's big ace in the hole on the right side. He's a really talented young kid, but you also have to make sure that you don't throw him into the deep end as soon as he reaches North America. I think he's going to have a really good pro career for Winnipeg. I don't think it's going to be like first pairing top end kind of stuff, although I do see him taking on that sort of DeMello supporting role, but it's probably going to take at least a year or two before we start to see him really feel comfortable in either the NHL or AHL. If he really does hit it off and immediately finds success at this level, I think it would probably change projections for this team and how Winnipeg's entire defense is going to be constructed, but I'm not going to bank on him being a hit success yet. So let's pump the brakes there and be realistic with our expectations for some of our young kids. There's a lot of talent there to work with, but maybe a little bit further off than we care to admit. Now, kind of on the subject of timelines, I did want to spend some time talking about how long it's probably going to take all of this to fully resolve. And I'll be honest, it's not going to be soon. We'll talk about that in just a moment and how the Jets can kind of prepare themselves in the meantime. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets. Thank you so much for rejoining us on these closing thoughts as we're just talking about, Winnipeg's big roster gaps and how long that's likely to take to resolve. I alluded to the fact that it's not going to be super brief, and I think if you're the Jets, you want to be careful that you don't try and rush things. The Jets don't really have to rebuild, and I think there is some incentive to try and push things quickly because Hellebuck's not getting younger, Scheifele certainly isn't. Connor's expiring here pretty soon, and Morrissey's definitely not getting younger either. So you have to make the most of like your top end players performing at a really elite level. Where I think the Jets are probably going to be cautious is that they want to get a sense of like what their ELCs are going to be at the NHL level, right? The first couple years, you get a discount on their contracts, and you have to sort of integrate them safely in a way that doesn't like crater their confidence when they go through dry spells. And so, I keep talking about this first year for me being kind of a learning experience for everyone. Arniel's going to get a chance to sort of try out a number of things. The kids are going to get a chance to take roles from established veterans and really fight for their place in the NHL. And I also think in a lot of ways, this is kind of a year where Winnipeg's going to experiment with special teams and try some tactical adjustments. Also at 5v5, right? Arniel's going to have his own ideas for how the Jets create offense, how they defend, how they adapt to structure and in-game adjustments, all that kind of stuff. And so for me, I don't know if like playoffs are like the biggest priority this coming year. Not that I think it's great if they miss it. I don't. I think you'd prefer to make the postseason, but I think the most important thing is facilitating that transition so that you're setting yourself up for a better run over the following seasons. That's why I kind of feel like with a trade market that's not going to be like ideal for what the Jets want to replace, which is, a second line center and probably two right-sided D. I'm not feeling like this gets fixed until probably 2 to 3 seasons down the road when you've had a couple of the ELCs stake claims to spots a little more firmly. You sort of want to figure out, is Lambert your 2C? Because he definitely could be, but until he's ready to show that, you're going to have to sort of make do. And on the right side, like Salomonsson could definitely be of interest. Ville Heinola has also been pretty comfortable playing on his offside, but I think that really depends on what you want on your left side, right? Because you've got Morrissey, Sandberg, and there's a big question of or Brendan Dillon, whether he comes back or not. Most likely not. It sounds like there's some suggestion that he might sign with the Canucks, which for him would be a hometown thing, and I think that would actually be a really fun fit. More power to him. I think he's going to get a big payday. On the right side, it's a little harder to figure out for the Jets. I think Dylan DeMello probably comes back. You're probably looking at, I don't know, some combination of Pionk or Schmidt, because I don't know if there's a team that's really ready to take on their cap hit right now. If I had to choose between the two, I'd probably move Pionk first. I think Neil is just really struggling and he's really slowing down, and that's been a much harder thing for the Jets to work around, whereas Schmidt's just a bit on the slower side, but otherwise still pretty decent at what he does, and he has a pretty decent track record of success alongside Sandberg. So if you're going to have one overpaid, struggling, aging D, probably Schmidt going to be the way to go there. And then you could try Heinola maybe on that right side, or you sort of talk about maybe folding Salomonsson in. There's a lot of ways that you can sort of work the third pairing, but longer term, you want Salomonsson sort of becoming the next DeMello. I think that's the best case scenario. I know it sounds maybe not super flattering, but remember, DeMello has been Morrissey's safety valve on the first pairing, which is, for what the Jets paid for DeMello and what they've gotten out of him, really amazing value. You really don't find many shutdown top-end blue liners who are reasonably capable of moving the puck. And look, DeMello has his warts. He's not the fastest. Sometimes he gets himself into trouble, but overall, right, he's been really great for this team. And if Salomonsson can even get to like 80 or 90% of that, I mean, that is fantastic. And it gives the Jets a little more breathing room to try and figure out some of the second and third pairing stuff. So I think, this is going to be a process of adjustments, and I think it's going to take probably 2 to 3 years. I think after that, Winnipeg's going to be in a pretty decent spot, but you do also have to ask yourself how much you really think Hellebuyck has left in the tank. He's had, multiple Vezina seasons now, including, the one that's probably coming at the end of this year. And so, is he going to keep playing at this level? It's tough to say. Will he ever become a really great playoff goalie? I don't know. But if you think that he's still going to be pretty decent after, the next 2 years or so, you're probably feeling okay with making, smart trades that don't really handicap you long-term, but that you still bring in some big upgrades for this roster over the next 2 or so seasons. And I think it's a delicate balancing act, and I certainly don't envy what the front office has to do. But, the one thing I do hope the Jets really go for here is skill and speed. I think those are two big things that the Jets could use in abundance. And if they play their cards right, I mean, they do have some really good pieces to work with, and they certainly have a decent prospect pool that can help supplement that, whether it's through trades or through actually taking roster spots from established veterans. So a lot for the Jets to consider. But if you're in this particular position, it could be a lot worse, right? The Jets, I think, are closer to becoming what they used to be than they are apart, but it's going to take some really savvy front office work this offseason and probably the next year or two after that for the Jets to really realize their potential. And I mean, I don't want to say it's going to happen because I feel like that's asking a lot, but so far, the front office has earned a little more faith from me than usual. So cross your fingers. Let's hope the Jets make some really good decisions and come away with some big upgrades. But I'd be curious to know what you think they're going to solve over the next couple of months. Do you think that they maybe bring in a big center, a big defender? Maybe neither, maybe both. What are your impressions of this offseason? Give me your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. Owing to some technical difficulties, I'm doing a double upload today, so our second episode will probably be focused a little bit on some of the playoff stuff. And just some general observations for the upcoming season and what I'm specifically going to be looking for tactically from the Jets. I think this coming year, for me, is very fascinating. We're getting a coach that seemingly wants to push the Jets in a direction we really haven't seen before, and I think that could be very, very fun if you're a Winnipeg fan. So we'll talk about that on our second episode, but for this first one, that is all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here in a bit for even more Jets and NHL coverage. As always, have a great night, and go Jets go.